In answer to your question, yes, this year is being recorded. So in addition, of course, to being the story of all of the individual families that populate Sefer Bereshit, Sefer Shemot is not about families anymore. It is the story of the birth of a nation. And we have the first notion of an Am mentioned in the beginning of Sefer Shemot. And so Sefer Shemot is about that change. It's about the transition from families and the wonderful midot that they had to us transforming, merging, growing, developing into a nation. So we're going to start Sefer Shemot. If you're using the Chumash, you're welcome to do so. It's not a requirement to follow the Shiur. So I just want to start with the very first pasuk. Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma et Yaakov ish uveito ba'u. I'm reading from the Art Scroll Interpretation Translation. And these are the names of the children of Israel who were coming to Egypt with Yaakov, each man and his household came. And then what follows is a list of the names. You wonder, like, why do we need to know the names? why, in fact, of course, the Sefer is called Sefer Shemot. It derives from the second word of the Parshat. But what's the point of that? Well, as a reader, if we didn't know the names of Yaakov's sons coming to Mitzrayim, would somehow the story be diminished? Would there be something about the story as it unfolds in the first 5 prakim, or as it unfolds throughout all of Sefer Shemot? Would we say, oh, we should have known that? So I don't have an answer, but I will share an answer, an insight that the Chidushei Harim. Rim stands for Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter, the first of the Gera Rebbes. And he suggested the following about the nature of the significance of the names, and names in general. So he reminds us of a pasuk in the first pasuk of the 7th parak of Megillat Kohelet. And it's a famous pasuk, maybe some of you will recognize it, which is Tov Shem Tov Mishemen Tov, which literally means good is a good name from good oil. Or let's just be a little bit more colloquially correct or readable. A good name is better than good oil. So the Chidushei Harim focuses on the fact that the Torah wants us to be aware of names and suggests that the Torah wants us somehow to be thoughtful and to ponder and reflect a little bit about the role of names. And so he says the following. I'll read it to you. It's not long, but it's an interesting insight or jump into this week's Parsha. Midrash Rabbah Kohelet, in the collection of Midrashim on Megillat Kohelet, it says Tov Shem Tov, a good name is better, and it says Hanania Mishael Sheyatzu Min Ha'esh, reminding us the story of Hanania and Mishael, who were thrown into a burning furnace, and God did a miracle for them. Tov Hanania Mishael Sheyatzu Min Ha'esh, who were saved from fire. Menadav ve'avihu shenisrefu v'hayu nimshachin b'shemen hamishcha. So the midrash that the Chidushei Harim is mentioning makes an interesting comparison between two names, two sets of names. Each name has something to do with fire. Hanania and Mishael, two Jews who, excuse me, as we know from Tanakh, were, they attempted to be executed. God wrought a miracle and brought them out of the fiery furnace. But then there's 2 other Jews who, in fact, were killed by fire. That was Nadav and Avihu on the inaugural day of the Mishkan, the 1st of Nisan. That takes place in Sefer Vayikra Parshat Shmini. And they, however, did not exit. They were not saved. They were consumed by the fire. And the Midrash suggests that an interesting observation here. And this is what he says. Shemen Tov. What is Shemen Tov? Well, it means good oil. But what's oil represent? Shemen Tov represents Mi shenitan lo gidula min hashamayim. Shemen Tov is a euphemism for someone who was given a bracha, the blessing of greatness from Shamayim. Now, who was typically anointed with oil? So anointed with oil were people who were blessed with or elevated to certain statuses, positions of service in the Jewish community. We know of the king. King was anointed with oil on the day of his inauguration and the day of his ascending the throne of Israel. Kohanim were anointed. Nadav and Avihu, as it were, because they too were Kohanim, were anointed. So they were given Shemen Tov. Hananiah and Mishael were not Kohanim, so they didn't have Shemen Tov. So the Chidushei Harim makes an interesting sort of comparison. And what does he say? Well, again, Shemen, Perush Shemen Tov, Mishanitan lo Gedula Mina Shamayim. A person who is given the elevated status by God, Ki'inyana Kohanim, for example, Kohanim who served in the Mikdash, Shahayu Meyuchadim la'avodato yitbarach, who were given and who were assigned service, holy service for God in the Beit HaMikdash. They were, as it were, anointed with oil. Aval, as good as that is, as good as it is to have that anointment of oil and to indicate, oh, you're a person of you're a Hashavua Yid, you're a Hashavua Kohen, you got this big job. Aval tov, mi shemarviach la'atzmo al yedei yigi'ato. But good, maybe even better, is a person who, through his own hard work, her own efforts, acquires for herself or himself a good name. And that is called a Shem Tov. So if you have to compare Shem Tov or Shemen Tov, Shem Tov is what you acquire through your own honest efforts, through your genuine commitment and dedication to elevate yourself. Shemen Tov represents an elevation not because of you, but because it was poured upon you. But the elevation that was poured upon you, and here I'm using the oil as the metaphor for the elevation poured upon you, that doesn't guarantee anything. Take a look at Nadav and Avihu. They were poured, as it were, they were given the blessing, the privilege of Shemen Tov, and yet they could not escape the fire. Hananiah and Mishael, they were not given this elevated status, but they did escape the fire. And so the Chidushei Harim starts off this week's Parsha by reflecting on the names, the notion, the Torah's insistence that we think about names and what names can do. A good name is the name that we create for ourselves. And that, in fact, is so much more valuable, so much more meaningful than the Shemen Tov is, as it were, the inheritance we get, not because we've done anything, but because some sort of goodness is poured upon us. Tov, Shem Tov, make Shemen Tov. And so begins Sefer Shemot. And I want to share with you at this point an attempt to understand how this story unfolds. And the first attempt is probably the one we are all so familiar with, and that's Rashi's interpretation. And we should be familiar with Rashi because Rashi, the holy Rashi, is the one who has guided us throughout all of Chumash. Rashi's undertaking to give a word-by-word, pasuk-by-pasuk explanation of Torah is this incredible accomplishment. And so that in our popular understanding of the story, that all of the images that come to our minds, all of the explanations, all of the stories that inform us of what happened, transpired to that generation of Jews in Eretz Mitzrayim, so much of it is based on Rashi's teaching, makes perfect sense of the centrality and the primacy of Rashi. But I want to contrast Rashi's understanding to a different Perush, and that of Rabbi Ovadia Seforno, who understands the story in a completely different way, and one which I have to tell you changes the story so profoundly, and I actually think in some ways offers an insight into so much more than this ancient period of history so long ago. It's almost like a window into a far more contemporary reality of Jewish society and Jewish life. So let's just remind ourselves of the story as Rashi understands it. So I'm not going to read the whole part. I just want to highlight a couple of phrases. So the Torah tells us in Perek Aleph, Pasuk Vav 6, Vayama Yosef v'chol echav v'chol ador. Who Torah tells us Yosef died in the entire generation. So his whole family, all his siblings. Yaakov has already died at the end of Parshat Vayikra. Yosef is, as we enter into Sefer Shemot, Yosef was alive. All of his siblings were alive, but they all now died. V'chol ador, the entire generation. Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishritzu vayirbu vayatzmu b'mod me'od v'timalei ha'aretz otam. The Torah tells us that Bnei Yisrael were fruitful, teemed, increased, and became strong. Very, very much so. And the land became filled with them. So just one word here that I want to make sure we understand how Rashi understands it. The word vayishritzu. Rashi, in the English, the art scroll says they teemed. They were fruitful, paru vayishritzu. They teemed. Now, the word vayishritzu has as the root the word sheretz. Does anybody know what sheretz is? Sheretz is sort of like a reptile. It's an insect. It's not exactly the nicest word to describe anybody. If you're going to talk about somebody whom you love and you hold in high esteem, you wouldn't call him a sheretz. In fact, when the Gemara talks about a sheretz, it's a source of tuma. A person goes to the mikvah and holds a sheretz in his hand, becomes, as it were, a metaphor for wasted effort. Like, there's no point in going to the mikvah and dunking while you're holding a sheretz, because a sheretz conveys and transmits tuma. So you can't go into the mikvah, which makes something holy, pure, while you're holding a sheretz. So vayishritzu is how the Torah chose to describe the way of fruitfulness. So just to be clear, so Rashi, as many of them before him, try to understand what's the point here. Like when the Torah uses the word vayishritzu, it's an odd word. So why? So Rashi says, shahayu yoldot shisha bekeres echad, which means there's something about a sheretz that really best describes the way in which Bnei Yisrael reproduced. They reproduced like shratzim, which is what? Multiple births, that every time a sheretz has, I don't even know what the word is, gives birth, it gives birth to many little shratzim. So that's the way the Jewish women gave birth. They didn't give birth to one kid, or maybe, there's twins. No, they gave birth to 6 kids at a time. So you can just imagine exponentially the rate of reproduction of the Jewish community if all of the women in Mitzrayim had babies and everybody is having babies like a sheretz. So Rashi is trying to somehow make this verb less distasteful to us. And how so? By telling us that the word was chosen to describe the way the birth took place. Multiple babies born at a time. Okay, and then comes the following. A new king arose, ascended the throne, who did not know Yosef, and we all know, was it really a new king? Was it an old king, but just somehow had a whole new policy, pretended not to know? Get to that maybe a little later in tonight's share. Vayomer Elamo, now I'm reading Pasuk Tet, and Paro, the king, said to his nation, Hine am b'nei Yisrael rava atzum mimenu. Behold, the people, the children of Israel, are more numerous and stronger than we. Rava atzum mimenu. Hava nitkak malo, pen yirbeva hayat ki tikrenu milchama, v'nosav gam hu al sonenu, v'nilcham banu v'alam min haaretz. Again, reading from the Art Scroll. And by the way, I know I've said this in the past. The Art Scroll translation in English is guided by Rashi. So wherever Rashi has an interpretation that would render the English in one, or direct the English, that's the way Art Scroll. That's a policy statement, and they talk about it openly in their introductions. So come, let us outsmart. That's what Paro was saying to his nation. Come, let us outsmart it, this nation, lest it become numerous, the Jews become more numerous, and it may be that if a war will occur between Egypt and another country, it, the Jewish nation, too, may join our enemies and wage war against us, and go up from the land. So what is Paro saying? According to this, Paro is saying that he's worried. He's worried that this is a huge fifth column. Again, that's a phrase to describe the notion of having in the midst of your community a group of people whose loyalty you doubt and who could turn on you. And so Paro is questioning the loyalty of Bnei Israel and is expressing a concern that should there be some sort of military conflict between Egypt and someone else, to go into war knowing that a huge part of your population isn't loyal to you, this is going to be crazy. The Allah min haaretz. I want to read Rashi here because it's important to understand Rashi's point of view to appreciate what we're going to learn about Sforno's point of view. The Allah min haaretz. So again, the Hebrew doesn't explicitly say who the subject is of that phrase, and go up from the land. So Rashi says, Ve'ala min haaretz al korchenu. Al korchenu, which means against our will. Ve'ala min haaretz. What does that mean? What's against our will? So will Bnei Israel leave against our will? Or will they push us out of the land against our will? Now listen to this part of Rashi. And Rashi says the following. The first part is, they will leave the land against our will. Now what's the problem with accepting that Rashi? Well, if you're Paro and you're worried that there's a fifth column, there's a huge portion of your population which is disloyal to you, then why would you be opposed to them leaving? Why would that be a problem? That would be desirable. You would want them to leave. So when Rashi says, Al korchenu, they would leave against our will, meaning without our permission, Rashi is aware that that translation or that explanation in some ways doesn't entirely make perfect sense. So he offers us something else. And this is what he says. Ke adam shemikalel atzmo v'toleh kilalto be'acherim, which means actually he's not referring to the Jewish people. When Paro was saying ve'ala min haaretz will go out of the land, it's referring to the Egyptians. That the Egyptians will be forced by the Jews living in Egypt, who will somehow achieve an upper hand and will push out the indigenous Egyptian population and force them to leave while taking over the land of Egypt. Wow. So when it says ve'ala min haaretz, although it sounds like that it's referring to a third party, not himself, Rashi says, no, he's referring to himself. But why would he do it? He says, because sometimes people are reluctant to discuss themselves in that way. Kedam shemekalel atzmo, because sometimes when a person speaks about themselves and speaks about negative consequences, we don't want to say it explicitly. V'harehu ki'ilu katav ve'alinu min aretz. So he sort of alludes to it instead of actively, explicitly writing, and we, ve'alinu, we will be forced to leave the land of Israel. So that's an interesting shot. Now, and this Rashi, so who am I to argue with Rashi? But I think we have a right to sort of think this through and to see what the implications are of Rashi's explanation. So according to this explanation, the second explanation I'm sharing, Rashi means that when Paro said, go out of the land, he's actually referring to himself or to the Egyptian population, and is saying that should there be some sort of war, should there be a moment of conflict, the Jews would be so powerful, so numerous that they will push us, the Egyptians, out of the land. But he didn't say us. He said push out of leave the land, sounding like it's talking about Israel. Rashi says, yeah, but it's a way of speaking where you don't really want to associate any bad outcome directly with yourself, so you only hint at it. We're assuming that Paro has the sensitivity to language that we have, that Chazal have, that the Gemara has. It could be a bit of a stretch. Not 100% sure. So that's one way of understanding the story. Paro is worried about the presence of this fifth column. So let's take a look at Sforno, who sees the story in a completely different light. Really, really different. So to set the story, let me just remind you of what we're talking about here. So do you remember the circumstances around which Bnei Israel finally came to Mitzrayim? Of course you do. So they got there, and what did Yosef do? Yosef essentially developed the Jewish ghetto, right? He had all the Jews living in a part of Mitzrayim called Goshen. And he really tried to the best of his abilities to insulate, to separate, to make sure that there was no cross-cultural influence, that whatever the Egyptian morality was, whatever that Avodah Zarah was not going to seep into the Jewish community. They had their own school system. In fact, from the story, you remember when Yosef was sort of testing the brothers, do you remember that there was one point in which they sat down to meal, but they didn't sit down together because certain ways and mannerisms of food that the Hebrews ate were considered to be really detestable by the Egyptian culture. So there were clearly these foreign elements. So the Jews, Bnei Israel, when they arrived in Egypt, were seen as what? Were seen as a group of people who were not integrated into Egyptian society. That was the goal. The goal was for Jews to be separate, for Jews not to be part of mainstream Egyptian society. And that's how Yosef and Yaakov together, and the brothers, tried to structure Jewish society. So, if that's the case, how do you think Egyptians felt about the presence of Jews in their midst? Would they want them to have been there or not? Would they have been seen as an asset, or would they have been seen as a liability? So let's take a look, and Sforno does not write much here, but what he says is fascinating. So let's go back to the first comment I shared with you about Rashi, which is the description of the birth rate. So the Torah says Vayishritzu, correct? Rashi said, oh, it's a description about just how many babies were born at a time. The babies were born the way shrutzim, these reptiles, give birth. Multiple lizards or reptiles born at each birth moment. That's Rashi's Vayishritzu. Listen to Sforno's Vayishritzu because it is so different. One second. Oh, here. Paru Vayishritzu says Sforno, V'achar shemetu kol shivim nafesh, natu lidarche shiratzim. And he says, just pay attention. When did this verb of Vayishritzu happen? It happened after all the generation died. After Yosef and that generation died, it's at that point that the Torah tells us Vayishritzu. But listen again, I want you to hear these words of Sforno because they are really not so pleasant. Natu lidarche shiratzim. You know what that means? It means that the Jewish people tended to follow the ways of shvatzim. Nothing to do with birth rate. This isn't a comment about birth rate. It's a comment about the Jewish population, the society. They began to attach themselves in a manner that Sforno says is a shvatzim-like manner, which is another way of saying they became Egyptians. They behaved in a manner that's like shvatzim. This was a description of Egyptian morality and lifestyle. And so after the Rabbis died, after Yosef and all the brothers died, thank God they're not here anymore. That influence, that stalwart influence, those are the people who connected you to the Zaidi, to the Alta land, the pre-war Europe, they're gone. The stories of Eretz Canaan, nobody's there telling me stories of Eretz Canaan anymore. So if nobody's telling you stories of Eretz Canaan, what are we going to do? We're going to find our home in Egypt, Natu lidarche shratzim. So whereas Rashi says Vayishritzu is a description of population growth, excuse me, according to Sforno, it's not a description of population growth. It's a description of assimilation, of integration into Egyptian society. Okay. So that's a whole different beginning to this understanding. So what happens? So the Melech sees that this people are now, in fact, becoming way too integrated into the land of Egypt. And people are now becoming much more concerned. Because after all, when they originally came, they were separate. Okay, separate's not bad, but they're not separate anymore. Now they're beginning to actively find all those places to connect. They're beginning to actively move into Egyptian neighborhoods, which, by the way, explains, and I think I've spoken about this last year, 2 years ago, when it gets to the Pesach story, why do we call Pesach Pesach? Do you remember the answer? Oh, Pesach means to pass over, which is what? How the Molech HaMovet passed over the houses of Bnei Israel and killed all the firstborn in the houses of the Egyptians. But wait a minute. If all the Jews are living in Goshen, there's nothing to pass over. They're all there, and all the Egyptians are living elsewhere throughout the land. But if you have to pass over one house to get to the other, what does that mean? It means that they're living side by side in the same neighborhoods. That's why it's called Pesach. And in fact, maybe that's a proof that Sforno's interpretation makes more sense. The whole notion of Pesach is an indication that there was a greater level of integration, assimilation, than we might have otherwise expected. Okay, so then we get to Paro's plan. So wait a second, they're no longer so separate. They're becoming way too integrated, way too interested, way too applying for all these positions or applying for all these jobs. They wait a minute, they want to take over jobs that might have been otherwise promised to whom? To Egyptians, born and bred Egyptians, whose grandparents are born in Cairo, but these parents are born in Beersheba, and they want all the jobs that the Egyptians are going to get. Doesn't this sound a little different than what you understood from Rashi? It sounds much different. So let's take a look again at Sforno. 1 second, I'm sorry, my friends. Okay, so Sforno says, so he comes up with a notion. What are we going to do? What's the best way to get people who are seem to want to be part of your community to reconsider? So, hava nitchak malo. We got to do this cleverly, the Torah says. Sforno says, lavo alav ba'akifin. We have to somehow find a way around. This can't be a direct conflict because that's not going to go. It's not going to work. We need to find a clever approach rather than a head-to-head conflict. And then, ve'alah min haaretz. So now we know what Rashi was saying. He was referring to the Egyptians. That Rashi was telling us that when Paro said ve'alah min haaretz, he was talking about himself. He was trying to come up with a less, perhaps deprecating way to talk about it. But that's not Sforno's shot. Sforno says this, ve'alah min haaretz me'atzmo. I want to find a way that the Jewish people on their own will want to leave Egypt. So we do not have to expel them deliberately. I don't want to do this, says Paro. According to Sforno, Paro was not looking to expel the Jews, meaning he didn't want them in Egypt. He wanted them out. But he didn't want to have to do it in a military fashion. He didn't want to do it by compelling them, coercing them, because he knew that was fraught with all sorts of problems. So we had to figure out a way that they, the Jews, will on their own come to the conclusion it's better for us to leave. Because he says, Sforno says, Paro says, I don't want to do it in a manner that people are going to criticize and come down against the government and say that we are not tolerant and we are racist. And I don't want that. I got to come up with a strategy that will look like this. It was their choice. We're not at fault. They did. So what we're going to do, what's one of the ways to give people cause to say, I'm pulling up stakes? I have an answer. And what's the answer? Say by asimu alav sarei misim. So let's tax them to death. That's it. when you take away economic benefits and economic advantages, then people say, well, we're out of here. It's costing too much to run our businesses. State taxes are too high. Let's move somewhere where we have more tax breaks in the corporate sector. Let's do that. Let's just tax the heck out of them. And they're going to say, well, it's just not worth staying here. Lama'an anoto. Let's put them vayasimu alav sarei misim. So he appoints all these ministers to collect enormous tax rates. Lema'an anoto, in order to afflict them. It says, Sforno, kadeshi askimu latzeit el eretz lacher. So they'll agree. Let's say, okay, that's it. You know, when we didn't have to pay this percentage of tax, that was okay. Now that you raise the tax, it's not worth hanging around Egypt. We're out of here. Thank you very much. And so, Lema'an anoto b'sivlotam vayiven arei miskanot, and so they built these cities called Pitom and Ramses. According to Rashi, when the Torah tells us that they put misim, taxes, what were the taxes? Rashi says they were the building of the cities. The cities were the taxes. That's how Paro taxed the Jewish people. He forced them to build cities. Listen to Sforno. This is like unbelievable. Sforno says, Arei Niskanot, these cities, Pitom and Ramses, Vehem Kiblu Lamas Livnot et Ha'arim. The Jewish people, Bnei Israel, said, wait a sec, you know what? This has been such a good run here in Egypt up until now that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to volunteer to build the cities. This will be our tax. How about that? So instead of paying this enormous, like 50% income tax rate, crazy, we're going to volunteer to build cities. We're good. We're builders. Even then, apparently, Jews were good builders. We'll do that. We'll take it on. They took it on. This is crazy. You hear the story that Sforno is drawing for us? Rashi's story is Paro is trying to figure out how to conquer the Jews. He's trying to beat them down. He's giving them taxes. And Rashi is saying, yes, they enslaved them. Sforno says they didn't want to go. They loved it there. It was a good place. After everybody died, Yosef and the brothers, they wanted to stay. They found it good. In fact, they loved it so much that they didn't want to stay in Goshen. They started spreading around, causing the Egyptians to get a little worried. Paro says, this is not so good. We're a little bit unhappy about this. So they had to figure out a strategy to get the Jews to want to leave. It backfired. It backfired because the misim, the taxes, were supposed to drive them out. Says Sforno, they didn't want to leave, but they wanted to stay. They wanted to stay so much that they undertook on their own to begin to build for the Egyptian king. It's an interesting take on the story, changing, I think, the way we look at this sort of pre-slavery Egyptian society and how Jews fit into that society, wanting to be there, wanting to be liked, wanting to make it so that the ruling power did not have any negative attitude toward them. When you think of Sforno's interpretation, it somehow, in my mind, we can talk about this at the end of the Shiur, takes on a completely different perspective, and I think rings much more true contemporary Jewish history than only ancient history. But it was so fascinating when I went through it this year, looking at this for the first time, and I said, I have to share this tonight. Which version rings more true? Of course, there's no way of deciding Rashi's right and Sforno's right. You can't do that. But it certainly does give us a bigger picture and a breadth of opportunity to consider the story in a completely different light. In fact, just to talk about this for 1 second longer, Rav Yosef Dov Levi Soloveitchik is a name that we usually associate with Rav Soloveitchik, who was the late Rosh Hashiva of Yeshiva University. But his name, Yosef Dov Levi, of course, he was named after his great-grandfather. His father was Moshe. His grandfather was Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. And Reb Chaim Soloveitchik's father is Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. He wrote a commentary to the Torah called Beis Halevi. And in that commentary, Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, Beis Halevi, suggests sort of something similar, sort of a little bit of a twist, a little different, how this whole process of enslavement unfolded. So when Paro began to think about this notion about strategizing and how to go about dealing with the Jewish problem, he realized that even in Egypt, there were limits to what he could do as a monarch, as a divine monarch. And simply eliminating a big portion of the population was not something he felt his own people would tolerate. Interesting. By the way, the Midrash offers a really interesting idea that at some point, Paro was much more tolerant of the Jews than his advisors and senior cabinet ministers were happy with. They wanted him to take a very aggressive position against Bnei Israel, and he was reluctant, and they deposed him. And it was only about 3 months later that he acquiesced and began what we now call that period of enslavement, and that's what we build a whole Haggadah story around, the story that you and I know about, the story of Shiur Mitzrayim, the enslavement, and the whole Pesach story. That's only after Paro sort of relented and took a different position vis-a-vis how to deal with the Jewish problem. But initially, he was not open to that sort of harshness, indicating, of course, that he understood that there's going to be a societal part to what he's about to do, and he needed to go about doing this carefully. And therefore, he wisely suggested to his servants and to his cabinet advisors that some aspect of Jewish society was not trustworthy. After all, they were very wealthy. Well, how did they get to be wealthy? Doesn't this sound so contemporary? How did Jews get to be so wealthy? They must have been earning their money on our backs, on the backs of the poor Egyptian workers. In fact, one Perush said something fascinating. Do you remember at the very end of Sefer Bereshit, the Torah talks about the 7 years of famine? You all remember that. So as the people in Egypt began to get to starve, they went to Paro, said, "Give us food." Paro said, "Go to Yosef." So Yosef gave them food until finally all of their money ran out and they had nothing to buy the food with. And so they said to Yosef, "We have no money." And Yosef said, "In that case, become indentured slaves to Paro." And so essentially, he created an entire population of slaves, resident Egyptians, not immigrants, Egyptians, as a way of sort of securing for them a supply line to food. They would become slaves to Paro. So you can imagine how this revolutionized Egyptian society. So when Egyptians took a look at the relative well-being and economic well-being of the Jewish population, they probably got really steamed. They really got angry. There are those Jews again. Look, on our back, on our coin, they're doing well. Why? Because we sold ourselves into slaves, and look at him. Don't forget, of course, that Yosef himself was an immigrant, right? He wasn't born in Egypt. So there's this immigrant coming to Egypt, getting the ear of the king, advising everybody, turning the whole country into slaves, and he's got all the power, and he's giving it to his family. So this has such a modern anti-Semitic trope to it, and we can hear. And Paro was building on this. And according to the Beis Halevi, one of the things that we read about in the Pasuk, and we make this a key part of the Haggadah Seder, when the Torah tells us, not in this Parsha, but in Parshat Ki Tavo, the key psukim that we interpret and we darshan on the Seder night of Haggadah, Vayareu Otanu HaMitzrim. Now, most interpretations and translations are that the Egyptians did evil to us, meaning they treated the Jewish slaves and the Jewish population population terribly with evil intent. But a more careful reading of the text, says Beis Halevi, points out that Vayareu Otanu HaMitzrayim is incorrect if the translation is they treated us with evil. That would have been Vayareu Lanu. Vayareu Otanu means they made us into evil people, which is another way of describing a campaign, a smear campaign, to change public perception of the Jews, meaning that Paro very cleverly realized that to take the position of the Jews who were successful, he needed to demonize them before his nation would agree to treat them evilly. Is that such a word? I'm not sure. And so he needed to demonize them, and that's what Vayareu Otanu means. That was part of the plan, to demonize the Jewish people. So either way, we're taking a look at the Beis Halevi, we're taking a look at the Seforno, we're taking a look at a complex, I think, social situation here that sometimes we don't spend enough time, I think, considering when we talk about the Pesach story. Okay, let's go a little bit further into the story. I'm going to move to Perek Bet. Perek Bet, it tells us about the marriage between a man and a woman, both from the house of Levi. We're talking about Amram and Yocheved, and a baby is born. The Torah tells us, "Vatahar Isha vateli ben," the woman became pregnant and she gave birth to a son. Vatere oto ki tohu, and the woman conceived and gave birth to a son, and she saw that he was good. Vatitzbenehu shlosha yirachim, and she hid him for 3 months. As what you probably already know, Moshe then was a preemie. The Paro and his soldiers understood that if the decree of killing all the babies by throwing them into the river was to be followed, then they had to keep track of who's pregnant. Otherwise, how would you know how to do this? And they did. They kept track of people who were pregnant. They sent the soldiers to smash down the door around the 9 months when babies were born. But according to what I just read, Yocheved was able to hide Moshe for 3 months before the soldiers were going to find out. So what does that mean? How is that possible? It means that she must have given birth to him at 6 months and had a 3-month gap before she was worried about that. The Torah tells us that she saw that he was good. So what's a good baby? Like, what does that mean? She saw, isn't every mother who holds the child, wouldn't every mom say, oh, this is like, recognize this as good in some way? Why did her especially find something good in her son? And every parent, I think, thinks that. So Rashi understands that could be an issue. So when you take a look at Rashi quotes in Midrash where it says, no, there's something about this child that was noticeably different. There was an aura, there was a light that sort of shone, indicating there was something special. But Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the great 19th century German commentary, maybe the father of neo-Orthodoxy, offers, I think, a very surprising, but also a very simple reading of the text, which sort of changes that whole perception that Rashi tried to suggest to us through the use of the Midrash. And Rav Hirsch writes that Yocheved noticed that her infant son would be what we all call such a good, have you ever heard that? Or maybe you said it. She's such a good baby. Have you heard that people say it? So what do you mean? What do parents mean? What do people mean when they talk about a good baby? I think it generally means doesn't cry a lot, right? They don't cry a lot. A good baby, they don't cry, they're not screaming, they're not colicky, smiley baby. Of course you have to feed them, but it's a good baby. It's a quiet baby. Doesn't require that much attention. That, Hirsch says, is what the Torah meant when it said that she saw that he was a good baby. He was less, I guess, cryful than other infants. He was more pleasant, a better mood. He did not often cry. And this is what led her to hide him from the Egyptian authorities. He was quiet. he was quiet. So a quiet baby can be hid. A baby that's screaming at 2:00 in the morning, obviously you're going to reveal that there's a baby here. There's some terrible stories, from the Holocaust about mothers trying to keep their babies from crying lest the Nazis discover them. And terrible stories about mothers doing that and ultimately smothering their own children in order not to have others be exposed because of the crying baby. It's terrible. But this baby who ultimately becomes Moshe, was in fact a quiet baby. And that's allowed for the possibility of evading the Egyptian search parties for newborn Jewish baby boys. Now, Hirsch comes back to this in a little while when he explains the story of Bicha, the daughter of Bat Paro, finding the basket in the river. So do you remember that? So let me just one more time. So Miriam the basket is put in the Nile, we know that. Vateri Bat Paro lirchotz al Yaor, v'na'aroteha hokot al yad hayor, vateri et teva b'toch hasuf, v'tishlachet amata v'tikacheh. Paro's daughter went down to bathe by the river, and the maidens walked along the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maidservant, and she took it. Vatiftach vatir ehu et hayeled. She opened it, and she saw him, the boy. V'hinei na'ar bochet. And behold, a youth was crying. V'tachmol alav, and she had mercy and pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys, one of the Hebrew babies." So Hirsch wants us to just think about that story for a second. And the Torah tells us that Paro's daughter noticed the basket floating in the water, and she sent her handmaiden to bring it, and then she opened it, and then she saw the child, right? Now, Hirsch understood this to mean that Bat Paro did not know what was in the basket until she opened it. She saw a basket. She brought the basket, opened the basket. Oh my goodness, look, there's a baby in it. So if that's the case, according to Hirsch, apparently Moshe, despite being all alone in a little basket floating in the river, and I guess presumably hungry, was not crying. He was not crying. Why? Because if he was crying, she would have heard the cries and she would have known exactly what's in the basket before she even opened up the basket. But the Torah wants us to know that she only discovered it's a baby after she opened the basket, which means that she didn't know what was in it until she opened it. Obviously, the baby was quiet, and so she had no idea what she was about to find until she opened it. He was not crying at the time. And it was only after Bat Paro looked inside the basket, she was able to, oh, behold, look, Nar Bochet, the child was crying. So the infant was frightened by the sight of the strange woman. Moshe got scared when he looked at Bat Paro. That's when he began to cry. But until then, says Hirsch, Moshe remained peaceful and quiet. So this explanation in this context might explain something about Moshe in general. Like Hirsch's explanation, I think, also leads us in a certain direction. We can already see, says Hirsch, I'm reading an English translation. We can see already in these little traits the tendency to the future anav me'od, exceedingly humble person, to the quiet, patient, modest, lack of pretension, which marked the great character of our great leader. So I know he's a baby. He's just like 3 months old, but here's a baby who's very unassuming. Here's a baby who's not drawing a lot of attention to himself. Here's a baby who seems to be able to be quiet. And as Moshe turns into the leader, one of the things the Torah tells us about him, he's an anav. He's a man who, maybe like the baby he was, is modest. And he's not showy, and he's not a person who attracts a lot of attention by virtue of the things that he does and he says. And perhaps that's already a quality that was visible in Moshe when he was just a little boy. Okay, oh my goodness, I'm looking at the time. Let's go on a little bit more. So in Perek Beit of Sefer Shemot, Ibn Ezra offers a fascinating explanation. I don't remember saying this last year, but it's an important point, and I think it's worth making sure we remember this even Ezra. We all believe that Hashem controls the universe. Correct. We know that. So if Moshe, who becomes the prophet, who is the incomparable prophet, there will never be a Moshe. Ain't Navi to Moshe. There's no Navi who's like Moshe. Why? Why was Moshe's beginning? Why was his youth? Why did it start the way it started? Meaning, Moshe was born to a slave family, Amram and Yocheved, but very quickly, as a baby, was adopted by the princess, Paro's daughter, and raised in the palace. So that was his growing up. All of his formative years, he grew up as a prince. He grew up as an Egyptian monarch, or in line to be a monarch. He was royalty. But why is that? Why is not the Redeemer of the Jewish people? Why not have the Redeemer come from the ranks of the Jewish people? That would have been a perfect story, wouldn't it? That somehow they're fighting out in mud pits of Mitzrayim, building stones or building pyramids or whatever, is this guy who comes and leads the people, who has faith in God, and through certain acts of bravery and courage and moral fortitude rises to the top and leads Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, becomes God's messengers. That's not how it happens. He has to be born into the royal family, or raised into a royal family. He ends up, for certain circumstances, escaping, running away, living in the desert, and it's only then that God chooses him. And even Ezra has a very fascinating explanation as to why this personal past of Moshe Rabbeinu is absolutely necessary and required for the whole redemption process. So, English translation of Ibn Ezra, he writes, for his soul to be on the highest level with regard to learning and habits, and not lowly and accustomed to being in the house of slavery. Interesting. Even Ezra says that Moshe was ultimately destined to be the leader of the people and to be the spokesperson of the Jewish people. He may not have wanted it, but that was going to be what God expected of him. So a person who needed to be the leader of the Jewish people, who needed to represent that, needed to have the ability to stand in front of men of power and feel that he can be their equal. And the only way a person can feel that way is if he believes that he is their equal. A lowly slave may very well psychologically not feel that, because that person's personal experiences, transformative experiences, foundational experiences, are that of slavery, of servitude, of subjugation, and having to somehow fight your way out of that. But a person who believes that they are empowered, maybe even entitled in a certain way, there's a Yiddish word, stolz, which means they have the strength of character and a posture to stand and to plant their feet in opposition to people who have power themselves. And even Ezra says, it would not have worked if the leader of the Jewish people had been born and raised as a slave and made his way through the ranks of slavery to become the leader of the Jewish people. Very interesting idea, which also goes one step further. The story that we just talked about is the story of Paro, who, as we just said, drew Moshe out of the water. And the origin of Moshe's name has been a topic of fascinating study and wonderment. Like, here's a man who becomes our primary prophet for generations, and every little boy and girl in 2023, regardless of the school you're going to, talks about Moshe Rabbeinu. And the name Moshe wasn't given to him by his mother and father, by Amram and Yocheved. Moshe was given to him by this Egyptian woman, which, by the way, the Midrash says was her reward. Because she cared for him at the risk of her own life to anger her father, God rewarded her by making sure that the name that she gave Moshe would be the name the Jews forever and ever and ever would remember him by. it likely, well, the Midrash tells us that his parents named him other names, but that's not the name we go by. We go by Moshe Rabbeinu. So a lot of people have wondered why the Torah wanted us to know his name. So one answer might be that drawing Moshe out of the water, that sort of act, and thereby the name is connected to the act, has perhaps a sort of metaphoric or broader implication that he was drawn out of a society of embittered, hapless slaves, right? Everybody is a slave, but he's drawn out of it. Literally, physically and literally, he was drawn out of that life. And the process of Bnei Israel's redemption was conceived at that critical stage, when the future leader was removed from the atmosphere of helplessness and characterized the nation and given a royal upbringing. It almost is like his name and his early history is a metaphor for Jewish history. When Paro's daughter drew Moshe from the river, she did so much more than just lift a little baby out of the water. She removed from Moshe the slave mentality in which he would otherwise have grown and developed, and provided him with the upbringing that prepared him for a life of strong and courageous and a reliable leadership. Now, I'm not Moshe, you're not Moshe, but as I often say, so is this a story about Moshe that has anything to do with me or you? When we hear this, what's it about? It's obviously about Moshe, but it might, according to this line of thinking, be a little bit different too. Many people, many of us find ourselves sort of floating in the river of our lives, helplessly accepting our condition and without really any hope of changing it. We're just in this basket and the wave is carrying us and nothing is going to change. The name Moshe should perhaps teach us the need to empower ourselves and to do that with hope and with an element of courage and with knowledge that we can, in not every circumstance, I know, but in many circumstances, take the actions necessary to pull ourselves out of the current of the water that's drawing us in a certain direction and improving it. It's a metaphor. And metaphors matter. They somehow touch our hearts. That Moshe could be drawn out of the water may be a metaphor for not just him, maybe for all of us. Maybe we can be that person to help somebody else to draw them out. Maybe we need the help of somebody else to draw us out. And I find it fascinating, of course, as I'm sure you do, that the person who helped draw Moshe out of that state he was in wasn't even Jewish. And I wonder whether the Torah is telling us that we shouldn't box people into these little pigeonholes and say, well, that person can't possibly help me because they don't know, or they're not the same as I am. You don't know who can be the person that ultimately is going to give you the hand or the advice or the resources or the push or the inspiration that can change your life. And sometimes when we create those boxes, put people into the boxes, we're not putting them in the box. We're really putting ourselves in the box. So thank you everybody for participating in the Shiur. Please unmute yourselves. And I would love to hear some of your thoughts.
It's correct, Rabbi. Yes, you're correct.
Thank you. I said, thank you. I was fascinated with the Sforno's description of what could have been the beginning of Jewish society in Egypt. I had not really studied that before this year. And this year, I took a look at it much more closely and said, wow, that's really different. But
Rabbi,
anyway.
I want to learn one thing that I don't find. What drew Pharaoh's daughter to save Moshe?
That's such a good question.
I mean, what tells us about society on that time? What tells us about the role of monarchy? Well, monarchy in those terms.
I don't, for me, Simcha, I don't think it's about monarchy. I think it's about humanity. Like, even though you take a look at Egyptian society and see what they were capable of doing, it's like in the Holocaust, in the Shoah, Simcha, righteous Gentiles. Like, how in the midst of all of the terrible brutality and savagery and immorality that just washed over so much of European society, up comes these people called righteous Gentiles. And they exist. So, but Paro may be like one of the examples of a righteous Gentile, that somehow she risked her life. Her father was the one who gave the order to kill the Jewish babies. She risked her life.
Well, I had to leave being part of the ship because things were going on here. But I missed the end of the part about the power wanting the Jews to leave. And the obvious question to me is if maybe it covered it, if power wants the Jews to leave when Moshe comes and said they want to go out for 3 days, why didn't he just say get into hate?
Why didn't he say what?
Get into hate. Go.
Why didn't Paro say that?
Yeah. He said the Jews wanted. He said he wanted.
It could be, Marty, at that point in the process, it was too late. Meaning, at that point in the process, at the beginning, according to Sforno, once that's how it started. He was hoping that they would leave. But then when they became a slave nation, then there was no need for them to leave because the fear that I think was the initial fear had been changed. Now that Egyptians felt they were ruling over the Jews, this was slave labor, was economically beneficial to have this cheap labor. They were killing the baby boys, so they felt they had the upper hand, where apparently in the beginning of the story, Paro was feeling that he didn't have the upper hand, that he felt that there was a real risk going on here. And if that first sort of, though the opinion that said that people were feeling that Jews were somehow taking benefits from the Egyptians, well, that was all taken care of. When they enslaved the Jewish people, that took care of that. Yes, so now we're getting back what we wanted. We're now in charge of them, and we're taking their belongings, and they're working for us. So maybe that, excuse me. So maybe that no longer was the mentality, and it changed in the process. But the part about that also interests me is that something happened to the Jewish thought process. That as long as Yosef and the brothers were alive, Eretz Canaan was the place that they were hoping to go back to. But something happened when they all died, and everybody settled into a fairly comfortable life in Egypt. That, and somehow rings as a contemporary feel to it, that part of it. Andy, I see you got a hand.
Well, I'm thinking that Sforno was a real person who lived in a real time.
Yeah.
And he saw this kind of thing. Well, he lived through this. He was in Italy, but he lived through the Spanish expulsion, the Portuguese expulsion.
Yeah.
He lived through periods when Jews had freedom to make money, become rich, and then when they got too rich, they got confiscated, thrown out, whatever. It makes sense for him to see that
Totally.
that dynamic.
Aside from that.
Listen, I think that it's true that, you know, the commentaries that we study are, as you said, they're people, meaning that they live in a social context. And how can you not have the social context affect the way in which you see things? And so it's not surprising. For example, Rashi, sometimes in order to best explain a word in the Torah, reverts to ancient French. And he puts a French translation, meaning that people will know when he's talking French, that's what the word means. So there is definitely an intersection between culture and influence and the way in which people see. Hirsch, who I quoted tonight, lived in Germany in the 1800s with the growth of and the birth of Reform Judaism. And there was a very strong push to sort of belittle the wisdom and the scientific basis for Judaism, which they felt was really just a religion of superstition. And so one of the things that Hirsch fought back against was, and you can see this in his commentary, is he fought back against it and he tried to demonstrate that it's not superstition and there really are very well thought out social reasons for some of the things in the Torah. And so he's responding to the influences of the time in which he lives, 100%, clearly. Clearly. Rambam too. Rambam is a philosopher who's definitely influenced by the writings of Aristotle. He talks about it. So they're not living at sort of distinct from and disconnected to the broader world, 100%. You guys are a quiet bunch. Come on.
You covered all the bases.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. Okay, well, I appreciate everybody coming tonight. I really do. And I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday night in Mitzvah Hashem. Have a safe week, a week filled with bracha and simcha and health. And although it's a little too early to say Shabbat Shalom, it's Tuesday, but I'll wish you a Shabbat Shalom anyways, because I won't see you between now and Friday night. So all the best, everybody. Thank you so much. And I'll see you next Tuesday night. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Rabbi.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.